I understand.
Welcome to BSRM Presents Straight Talk. This is Dhaka Tribune editor Zafar Sobhan, and today I'm in conversation with Indian journalist and author Shamrat Chaudhry. Shamrat, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So, Shamrat, I want to talk about a number of things today. Specifically, we'll be talking about the NRC in India and how that impacts populations, specifically Bengali populations in the Northeast. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about you and your family background, and that'll reveal, I think, why I think you are the ideal person to have this discussion with. So, the floor is yours.
Well, my roots are in what is now Bangladesh.
Yeah.
My ancestral roots. My father's side of the family is from Sylhet, and mother's side is from Moymonsin.
Right.
And they moved at partition.
Okay.
Into northeast India, into what is now Meghalaya. So my father studied in Shillong after being driven out of Assam.
I see.
In anti-Bengali riots in the 1960s. My mother moved there after marrying him.
Yeah.
In those days it was an arranged marriage, so the luck of the draw, and they ended up in Shillong, which is where I was born.
Okay.
And this was shortly after the formation of the state of Meghalaya. Meghalaya was formed in 1971-72. I was born in 1974.
Yeah.
And my earliest memories, which relate to identity and identity politics, especially the Bengali identity, go back, I think, to somewhere around 1979, which
okay, you'd have been
I was
5
years old.
Yeah.
Of course, I didn't understand what was happening then, but I remember a sense of fear and sirens.
Achha.
And so later on, I came to know that that was the first major anti-Bengali riots in Shillong.
In Shillong, I see. So it's very interesting. You just you remember there being fear and these things, and then you put it all together afterwards, what that was.
So that's where I grew up, and that's where I went to school, and this was through the 80s and early 90s. We were a small community, but not an insignificant community.
But how was it at school then? So was there a sort of a marked difference, a divide? People, between various communities, were you quite aware of the fact that you were ethnically Bengali?
It was not made by the school.
Yeah.
But it was something which we were all acutely aware of.
I see.
Because it was somehow just there. I don't know whether it was there partly because of the insularity of the Bengalis, because after all, Meghalaya is a tribal state, is predominantly Khasi tribal area. So the dominant group there is the Khasi.
Yeah.
And I think there are perhaps faults on all sides that led to the conflicts that we grew up with.
Yeah.
But basically, we were, to answer your question, very acutely aware of who belonged to which community.
Right. It seems to me that your position is, your identity is this ethnic Bengali growing up in Shillong has informed and impacted a lot of the work you've done. I'm thinking, for instance, of two of your current projects. One is Insiders, Outsiders, which is a book. It's a book of essays, if I'm not wrong.
Mainly.
Belonging and unbelonging in Northeast India. And then, of course, you're also on the board and working on the Partition Studies Quarterly. So talk a little bit about these two publications and how you came to them.
The book first, the Insider-Outsider issue. We started working on it in 2016. Me and a lady named Preeti Gill, who used to be in publishing in India, and so we started talking about the fact that this issue had not been really documented, that we had gone through this entire process of people being driven out, killed, houses burnt for decades.
Yeah.
So an entire population, the population that migrated to a large extent from East Bengal, at partition or maybe after partition, up to 1971. This population suffered for the second time.
Yes.
Sometimes the same people, sometimes the next generation, sometimes the generation after. But basically 3 generations went through this entire process of being driven out from
Yeah.
home after home after home,
Yeah.
and being othered,
Yeah.
and being forced to scrabble together a living, because we also had restricted rights in the places that we
Right.
went to, and still do. But none of the stories had been told. So I was keen that the stories be told, but I was also keen that we should make it an inclusive exercise.
Right, from the
And-
other perspective as well.
to get in as many perspectives as possible, and to try and bring closure to
Yeah.
this difficult topic, which we all were acutely aware of, knew
Yeah.
about, but never spoke about.
Sure.
So that's where it started.
Yeah.
And as far as the partition studies quarterly is
Yeah.
concerned, when I was doing the book, when Preeti and I were sort of, it's an edited volume. So when we were
Yeah.
doing the book, we realized that a lot of this has to do with partition.
Yeah.
And so I talked with one of my friends who's a professor of history at the Northeast Hill University in Shillong, a man named Binayak Datta.
Yeah.
And he has been working on this topic, partition. And so I think it was out of conversations with him that basically we decided to do this documentation work again. Because while partition in the West,
Yeah. It's
meaning
been
Punjab,
very well
is very
covered.
well remembered and documented, partition in Bengal to substantial degree is remembered. But the fact that the northeast of India, that Assam, for example, suffered partition as well, that
That's
there was a
right.
referendum in Sylhet.
That's right, yeah. And
These are things that people don't remember,
Yeah.
at least on the Indian side of the border.
And it, of course, impacts all of us. As you mentioned, your family moved in 1947. My family had a similar trajectory in the other direction. My father's family is from Murshidabad, and so we ended up, of course, here. So I think there's a massive percentage of families on either side of the border who have actually been impacted by partition. It's very alive in our lived history, in our lived experience. I mean, I think you're right. It's something we don't really think about or write about as much. There were a couple of TV shows here and there about it, which I even participated in. But that element of it, of how the impact it has had on, let's say, the Bengali people or the people in this region, and how that's really shaped 2 countries, Bangladesh and India, is something which deserves more time and attention, I think. You're one of the people I know who's actually spent most of his time traveling around India. You're a working journalist, so you have been for many, many years, working for many newspapers all over. Do you think there's something to do with being a Bengali, growing up in Shillong, that inspired you to see as much of India as possible, and that might be one of the reasons you've traveled around so much?
It's a bit of a, there were certainly pull factors,
Yeah.
the draw of the big city, etc., but there were also push factors.
Yeah.
So, for example, after 12th standard, after class 12 exams, it is generally been the norm for most people in Shillong, if they are able to leave the city
Yeah.
and study outside.
Yes.
This is regardless of which community you belong to.
Right, you want to go to one of the best universities
You want to go
can,
somewhere
yeah.
and study somewhere else and
Yeah.
maybe work somewhere else. But there are additional factors. For example, job reservation, reservations in education.
Yeah.
In the state of Meghalaya, it is pretty much, it's over 80%.
I see.
And so there is actually very little chance of anybody getting a job back in Shillong.
I see.
The only jobs are government jobs, and those are pretty much reserved.
Yeah.
And so then you know that after your 12th standard, you go out and you study somewhere else, and then you better find something to do out there, because
Right.
there's nothing to do if you come back.
Okay.
So for decades now, people have been slowly migrating out.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
so basically the Bengali population of Northeast India, which again may have been to a substantial degree migrants from here, have been slowly exfiltrating out further.
Right.
Some have gone abroad, some are in other parts of India, but the movement
But it's a very
is
common
ongoing.
phenomenon, and there's very concrete reasons behind it. Hold that thought. We're going to take a commercial break. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit about the NRC, which is where we have been moving towards with this whole discussion so far, and how these identity issues have really impacted it. But we'll catch that after the break. Please join us after the break. Thank you very much. Welcome back. Shamrat, so let's move quickly into talking about the NRC, the National Register of Citizens, and specifically how it impacts Bengali populations in Assam, which is the state in which it has been instituted.
Well, the largest single group which has been excluded is Bengali speakers.
Yeah.
And out of this, the Bengali Hindus are the single largest chunk.
Yeah.
The official figures are not out, so we don't know what the exact numbers are, but there are estimates floating around that out of 19 lakh excluded, more than 10 lakh
Yes, I've heard those numbers as well. 10,
Bengali,
12 lakhs even, yeah.
Are Bengali Hindus, and the second largest group, it would be somewhere 4 to 6 lakhs, would be Bengali Muslims.
Yeah.
So basically, if out of 19 lakh, at north of 15 lakh are Bengalis,
Yeah.
by any reckoning,
Yeah.
Hindu plus Muslim, then obviously we don't have to look far to understand who is being impacted by the exercise.
Yes. But the interesting thing is, it strikes me as there's a tension here between what the centre's agenda is and what the agenda of, let's say, the Assamese people would be, or the Assamese government. In that, the centre is very focused on Bengali Muslims. But I think for the Assamese, they would not necessarily draw such a great distinction between a Bengali Hindu and a Bengali Muslim, or even someone who's from West Bengal or someone who's from Bangladesh.
That is true, because for the Assamese, their fear has always been fear of
Bengali
domination by the
domination.
Bengali, so they don't really make a distinction between Bengali Hindu and Bengali Muslim. In fact, they may be less fearful of the Bengali Muslim.
I've read about that, you know, in terms of a lot of the economic power is actually held by Bengali Hindus, you see, whereas the Muslims, the Mias, I believe they're called, they generally do not, you know, they're there, but they have different kinds of jobs and a different kind of impact on the society.
So for the Assamese, it is true that historically that has been the direction, although the government now is a BJP government in Assam as well as at the center.
Yes.
So the fact that this happened is not because of what the government wanted. The BJP, both at the state and at the center, seem to be very uncomfortable with the fact that so many Hindus have been excluded from the national register, and they are proposing to bring before Parliament a bill called the Citizenship Amendment Bill, which will give preferential citizenship or easy citizenship, relatively speaking, to Hindus from Bangladesh, Pakistan and Afghanistan.
The ultimate triumph of Jinnah's two-nation theory.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's not certain whether it will pass muster in the Supreme Court, because I'm sure that cases will be filed, and it seems to go against some essential features of the Indian Constitution. But it's likely to pass Parliament, because that's how the numbers stack up.
No, I mean, I think the way they're going to phrase it is they won't say, well, if you're a Hindu in one of these countries, you're automatically welcome. They will say that if you're suffering from religious persecution, I think that's how they're going to phrase it. And then the bar for what constitutes religious persecution is something which can be set at a fairly low level.
Yeah, because it would be practically impossible for anybody to prove that they had or they had not faced persecution, that they had gone and settled down somewhere in northeast India because of something that happened.
Right.
So it's not clear how they'll make this whole thing work.
Yeah, but it's interesting, you know, as we said, it seems therefore there's a tension. So you said not between the government in Assam, which is a BJP government and is aligned with the center, but if there is a strong vote bank within Assam, and are people having this discussion there where they're saying, well, you know, the whole point of the NRC is we want to actually have Assam for Assamese, and if you're going to keep 1.2, 1.3 million Bengali Hindus, and you know, let's say, okay, fine, you get rid of the 600,000 Muslims who are deemed to be Bangladeshis or what have you. That solves the problem for the BJP, and it addresses their agenda, it addresses their wish, it addresses their campaign promises. But it doesn't really address the issues of the ethnic Assamese people. How is that circle to be squared?
It's not clear. You're absolutely right, because the agitations for decades now in the Northeast have been to evict Bengalis.
Yes.
And not Bengali Muslims specifically.
Yeah.
So there have already been protests in the Northeast because the Citizenship Amendment Bill was brought before Parliament once already.
Yeah.
And passed the Lok Sabha, the lower house of Parliament, but failed to clear the Rajya Sabha, the higher house, the upper house. So there have been protests already, and there will probably be further protests. The way that it might be dealt with is through provisions of something called the inner line permit. Okay. So the hill states in the Northeast have a sort of internal regulatory mechanism,
right,
by which they can regulate who can come into their territory.
Right, from the rest of India.
From the rest of India. So they will probably bring in provisions such as those. For example, Meghalaya has already proposed that any Indian who wants to visit Meghalaya for more than 24 hours would have to take a permit.
I see.
And some states already have the inner line permit regime in place. So they will probably protect the hill states in that manner from so-called waves of immigration. And the case of Assam, I think the specifics are not clear, but they'll probably have to force through some means the Bengali and the Assamese people to make peace.
Yeah.
That's the political game that seems to be on.
And it could be that if they say, well, okay, you know, there's 1.9 million, but if we manage to rid ourselves of 600,000, then, you know, we can call it a day and everyone can go home. That's a fine compromise. Do you think, I mean, I've read articles about camps being built for displaced people, but what is your sense as to whether the government will actually be able to go through with this? Let's say, even if you just talk about the 600,000 or 400,000, whatever the number is, Bengali Muslims, are they likely to then be eventually rendered stateless, and then how do you see that playing out?
I just want to go back to the previous question a little bit.
Yeah, of course.
And so there is a tension between the Hindu nationalism, which is dominant now, and the sub-nationalisms.
That's right.
So we had many of these sub-nationalist movements which actually fought for independent territories in the Northeast, and they are now in the process of being subsumed.
Yeah.
So there is a conflict under tension, but it seems that they're being subsumed by the larger Hindu nationalist ideology.
Rhetoric, No, my question was that do you actually think that they're going to go through with this? So we often hear saying, well, you know, this is an issue, but you know, the Indian government always tells us in Bangladesh, for instance, that it's something we don't need to be concerned about because it's an internal issue. But of course, we're thinking, how can it just be an internal issue if at the end of the day you have 600,000 people rendered stateless? And you know, what will happen to them? And will there be pressure placed on Bangladesh to take them in? What's your sense?
Well, the government has been assuring Bangladesh that it is an internal matter. The detention camps that have been built will accommodate a few thousand people.
Right.
The rest of the people...
But you can't put 600,000 people into detention camps.
You can't put 600,000 people in detention camps. So the end game is not clear. At present, the process is that the people who are not in the NRC can appeal to the foreigners' tribunals. They have a window of 120 days, which is ongoing at present. And they have to appeal. So they have to fight cases, and they can fight their cases all the way up to the Supreme Court. The problem is that a lot of these are very poor people. So they lack the means to actually fight all the way up to the Supreme Court.
Sure.
So what will happen to them, I don't think anybody knows at present.
Yeah. And my next question is, this is of course, you know, right now localized in Assam. Will this now be then implemented all over the Northeast and indeed all over India? I mean, Assam seems to be the test case, in a sense.
Yes, Assam is where it started because of the Assam agitation and because of the Bongal Khadao, it was called, riots of the 1960s onwards. Right. So Assam is where it started. This exercise was actually driven by the Supreme Court of India under Chief Justice Ranjan Gogoi, who is due to retire, who happens to be Assamese from Assam, and therefore very closely aware of the issues involved.
Sure.
And so now it's not clear what's going to happen next.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. It seems to me that a big part of the sort of the BJP's vision for India is to completely remake India. You see?
Yeah.
And so it's, you know, also in terms of knitting it together into a more unified whole. So linguistically, for instance, they're very much promoting the Hindi language.
Yeah.
You see?
It's Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan used to be the catchphrase.
Okay.
And the NRC as a national thing is something that the present Home Minister and BJP
Yes.
Chief Mr. Amit Shah has promised in electoral speeches.
Right.
And the RSS, the
Yeah.
Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, has backed. So there is definitely an interest in extending this to all states in the country. I don't understand how it's going to work, because issues that have crept up are not just communal issues, they are also issues of documentation.
Yes.
We are not countries with great depth of quality documentation.
Correct.
Now they want poor people to submit birth certificates, school certificates, passports, property documents, etc. The way that you prove that you are a citizen.
Yeah.
Now most of these are things that people just don't have.
Yeah.
They may very well have been born in India, they may very well be Indian, but these are not things that they would have. Earlier people would be born at home,
Yes.
not
In a hospital.
Not in a
that's
hospital.
Yeah.
They might not complete any certification in school or whatever it is, so they don't have educational certificates. Nobody had passports. Of course they don't have passports.
Yeah.
And so on and so forth. So you go down the list and maybe you might hope that they might have their names in the voter list. But the thing is that they want the name in the voters list before March 1971.
So that's hard to...
Before formation of
Bangladesh. Yeah. That's hard to show. Well, yes, so I think what it seems is that there's still a lot of questions to be answered, and that no one, even in India, really knows which way it's going to go. So I think for all of us, we need to sit and watch and then see where this takes us. Anyway, we're out of time. Shamrat, thank you very much. I've enjoyed this conversation. I think this has been very educational and enlightening for our viewers. We don't often get the opportunity to have someone like you come in and speak with such erudition on difficult topics such as these.
Thank you very much.
And thank you. This has been BSRM Presents Straight Talk. I am Dhaka Tribune editor Zafar Sobhan. I've been in conversation with Indian journalist Shamrat Chaudhary. Please tune in again 2 weeks from today. Thank you very much.
I understand.